Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm thrilled to greet you all and welcome you to Conversations in Black Freedom Studies Virtual Edition. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to Latia Eli for live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired. We will paste instructions for viewing those captions in the chat window now. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. And we have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, such as our Black Liberation Reading List, events like this one, and much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. At the Schomburg Center, every month is Black History Month, and February is too. The first week of February is also the Black Lives Matter at School Week of Action. So a special welcome to all of the parents, teachers, and students who are tuning in right now. You can learn more about that movement at blacklivesmatteratschool.com. The Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series is a space to talk about new works in Black social movement history. Sometimes it's helpful to learn new things about historical figures we thought we knew well. And other times we gain new perspectives by learning about lesser known activists in the movement. So whether you're well-versed in civil rights history or pretty new to learning about it, we hope tonight's discussion will be fruitful and useful. Tonight, we consider the lives and legacies of 4 figures from the US civil rights movement: Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Dr. Gwen Patton, and Julian Bond. To guide us in this, we're so fortunate to have 3 amazing authors talking about their work. In a moment, we'll introduce Ashley Farmer, author of Remaking Black Power: How Black Women Transformed an Era, who will speak about the work of Dr. Patton on the occasion of the posthumous publication of her memoir, My Race to Freedom: A Life in the Civil Rights Movement. We'll also have Pam Horowitz, who contributed a foreword to a new collection of also posthumously published writings by her late husband, Julian Bond. And we have Peniel Joseph, author of The Sword and the Shield: The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. If you haven't already, you can purchase all 4 of these books at the Schomburg Shop. That's schomburgshop.com. Virtual events, of course, are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. For example, when we get to the last portion of our agenda, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you will be near the bottom of your Zoom window, and just type your question into the box that pops up. We're also streaming live to YouTube, and we'll take questions there too. This event is being recorded and will be available for anyone to view after the fact on the Schomburg Center's live stream page. By default, all of you watching will remain anonymous in that recording. If we read out your question, we'll only mention your first name to preserve your anonymity. And this is an important discussion. I'm quite certain we won't get to every question, but we'll do our best. So feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them in the last part of tonight's agenda. And now I'd like to bring on stage my co-moderator for tonight, Brooklyn College professor of political science, Jean Theo-Harris. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Brian. It's so great to be here. And as Brian was saying, it's so exciting to have Conversations in Black Freedom Studies online this year. For those of you who've been with us before, this is our 8th year. Kamosi Woodard, who's a professor at Sarah Lawrence, and I started this series 8 years ago because there were fewer and fewer spaces where we could sort of sit together and learn and hear about new work in Black history. Some bookstores had closed, and so we wanted to kind of create a space, and kind of the Schomburg had played that role for so many years to bring us together, to get to experience new work, but also to get to think together about that new work and how it helps us think about our history, but also where we go from here. And so this is our 8th year, and we're obviously doing new things this year with the online format. And Kamosi has stepped back into a more emeritus role. But we're so excited to be here tonight. We're so excited for this conversation tonight and thinking about the kind of legacies of King and Malcolm and Gwen Patton and Julian Bond and how they help us think both about our past, but also about where we go from here. As usual, for fans of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, we meet on the first Thursday of every month. And so we will be back on Thursday, March 4th, and we're going to be talking about Black women in history and struggle. And we're going to have Dana Ramey Berry and Callie Gross talking about their award-winning book, A Black Women's History of the United States. And I'm actually going to be part of the conversation because 2 days ago, I published with Randy Colbert a young adult version of my Rosa Parks biography. So we're going to be talking about that next month. So I'm very excited. And I also have to say, just for full disclosure, the book we're going to be talking about in terms of Julian Bond's Time to Teach, Pam and I co-edited it. So just for full disclosure. And so I'm so excited to welcome first Ashley Farmer. Ashley is an historian of Black women's history, intellectual history, and radical politics, and an assistant professor in the Department of History and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Pamela Horowitz was one of the first lawyers hired at the Southern Poverty Law Center. She worked in partnership with her late husband, Julian Bond, who was one of my mentors and teachers, in multiple public, private, and academic projects, and is involved in several activities honoring his legacy, including, here's our book, Julian Bond's Time to Teach. And finally, Peniel Joseph is a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Somehow we have Texas in the house twice today. And he's also the founding director of the LBJ School's Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. So welcome. So obviously, Ashley and Peniel have been with us before. This is a new format. And so instead of formal presentations, I think we want to start with each of you kind of talking about your connection to these civil rights movement figures and how you come to do the work we're going to be talking about tonight. And Ashley, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I encountered Gwendolyn Patton, or Dr. Patton, as I was studying women in the Black Power movement. She was a dynamic intellectual. She was part of the folks that organized in Alabama and Lowndes County with the original Black Panther Party. And she was also somebody who organized alongside, but never really entirely within SNCC. And really fostered their kind of feminist consciousness through creating the Black Women's Liberation Committee. But one of the things that I really learned from her biography or autobiography is how deep her ties to the Black freedom movement were once I got more into it. So not only was she, roommates with Stokely Carmichael and somebody who traveled around talking about Black Power, but she was a multi-generation freedom fighter with family who had worked in the Montgomery bus boycott, folks who had gone to Detroit and worked in the workers' movement and the audio movement there. She was a consummate organizer of student activists and one of the foremost Black anti-war activists in Vietnam. So my entry into her really was kind of, what does it mean to be a Black woman advocating for Black power? But through her, I found her to be such a kind of diverse and rich intellectual in kind of her pursuits.
Thank you. Pam, how about you?
Well, as Brian mentioned, I was married to Julian, and so this was, for me, literally a labor of love and another means, as you said, Jean, to further his legacy. The book was made possible by the fact that Julian wrote out his lectures in full sentences, which I am not an academic, but I am told some of my best friends are. And I am told that it is highly unusual to have had the lectures in the state that they were in, because he was constantly revising them. He taught for over 20 years by the time he died in 2015. And so there was a lot of historiography that came out from when he started until when he retired. And he tried to incorporate as much of it into his lectures as he could, went to a PowerPoint. So we were able to compile the lectures pretty much as he gave them in his last years. And I think we can say that every word is his. And they were, for the most part, beautifully written. And so the editing was pretty light. And the other person I have to thank, in addition to Julian, for it coming into fruition is Jean, because she had asked Julian if he was interested in writing a book with her about teaching the civil rights movement. And he had said, asked me after I retired, and he added that, you should know I don't want to do a whole lot of work. But then after he died, Jean raised it with me. And so it turned out she was working on another book, that the fact that it's coming out now, I think, is for a fortuitous timing, which we didn't really plan. But I think that, you know, after George Floyd, a lot of people started saying this is a movement, not a moment. And I'm not sure that it is, but it's more than a moment. And so I think all of this is timeless. I mean, we knew that looking at the history of the civil rights movement was not time sensitive, that it's a central part of the centrality of race in our country. But I think the timing is good in terms of people's interest. And so I think Julian's perspective is unique because he was both a participant in and a scholar of the movement. And that comes across all the time in the lectures.
Thank you. Peniel, how about your journey to this book, and how did you come to tell this story?
Yeah, Jean, thank you. And to all the participants as well for the invitation. Yeah, you know, I'm a native New Yorker, so born in Brooklyn, raised in Brooklyn and Queens. And my mom, I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants. I was on my first picket line in elementary school over 40 years ago. So most of the people who you encounter studying Black history were not active participants in that story, but my mom was, SCIU 1199. And so, you know, my family is very, very political, and we didn't have to we weren't taught how to be Black. So we didn't need a Malcolm Martin and Marcus Garvey t-shirt from the late 1980s to learn how to be Black, which happens to a lot of Black folks, actually. So it's a rare privilege. So finding out that Dr. King and Malcolm, 1199 was their union, so was Stokely Carmichael's. So I actually grew up around Black folks and folks from the Caribbean and Haiti and Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, and at times Eastern European Jews and others who actually had marched with Dr. King, who had seen Malcolm X, you know, having family and friends in Harlem and the Bronx and other places, really got me into this history of the Black Power movement. And even what Ashley was talking about with Gwen Patton, my dissertation dealt with Gwen Patton and the Third World Women's Alliance, and sort of, you know, I've been in the space of Black feminist scholarship since graduate school with Sonia Sanchez. So I look at Malcolm and Martin as these big global repositories for all of these stories, right? So the stories of the Black quotidian, the stories of Black women and men and others can be told through their lens. And so what I tried to do, and the reason why I'm so inspired by them, is that if you strip away the iconography, they're actually, Malcolm is a working class hero, and King is a middle class, upper middle class elite who actually sort of commits class suicide and wants to be down with sharecroppers. So they're very, very interesting and intriguing to me. And they both have real connections to New York City. I'll finally say that Malcolm is basically an adopted New Yorker. He's a Harlemite. He lived in Queens. You know, East Elmhurst, Queens. We all knew where Malcolm X's house was growing up. So it's an extraordinary New York story. Dr. King has an important New York connection in Harlem and trying to negotiate with big city police chiefs after the Harlem Rebellion of 1964. So all of that got me interested, but it's really my mom who was the first historian, first teacher, first intellectual and activist. But the fact their strong ties to labor unions and social movements got me interested in both of them.
Thank you. So now we're at the part of the program where you're going to teach us something. And I think, Ashley, we're going to start with you because in some ways, for our audience, Gwen Patton might not be as familiar as Julian Bond and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And so if you could share a story or two from her life, from her work that sort of illuminates her politics, her contributions, what we can learn from her life.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Patton was born in Detroit and kind of did the reverse migration and really found both the political and the Black community home in Alabama. She was the first Black woman student president at Tuskegee. And from then on kind of became a wonderful consummate student activist and devoted her life both to teaching people about the movement, but kind of moving from different movement spaces and connecting different movement spaces in service of, you know, the kind of immediate needs of a community, but also the broader goals of freedom. So I'll kind of share two short stories if I can. One is that she would always migrate back down to Montgomery to see her family every summer, no matter where she lived. And one of those times, basically she was driving along, the car sounded funny, and next thing you know, there's an explosion. And she says she kind of woke up, you know, thinking that she was dead and ended up in the hospital. But what is remarkable about this story is the number of people and the different types of people that came to see her as she convalesced in New York, right? It was James Baldwin, it was Yuri Kojima, it was James Foreman, right? It was Richard White's daughter. And even though some of them had never actually met her, her reputation of being a freedom fighter, her reputation of standing up and saying, this is what I think, this is what I believe, going along with anybody just because it's cool or hip. You know, I'm not going to be with the Panthers because they got guns today. I'm not going to be with these people because they have doing this today. Was really a testament to her work. So I think that the way she was revered in the movement, even as a young person, says a lot about kind of her dedication on day-to-day level. The other story briefly I want to tell is about her work with student unions. So she was the president of Tuskegee Student Union. And after that, she always believed that college campuses were a ripe place with which to politicize people, right? People might be from different classes, different backgrounds, but this is where you could get people to move in the spirit of Black liberation. So she created the National Association of Black Students. And the idea here was that it was a rival association from the National Student Association, which was white one and really not giving Black people their due or servicing Black interests. So they decide that they're going to demand reparations from the NSA, the National Student Association. And she stages this wonderful protest at their conference where they're going to unplug all the mics, rush the stage, right, and demand reparations. This is around the time reparations is very popular due to Queen Mother Moore and James Foreman. But my favorite part of the story is that they get the white folks to give them 50 grand to start NABS, the Black Student Association. And she sits back down, and Cesar Chavez is sitting next to her in the seat in the audience. And he leans over to her and is like, you know, we really should get some of that money because we've been oppressed by the white folks too. And Gwen Patton turns to them and says, you didn't struggle for this money and I didn't oppress you. You work out your own reparations scheme. Right. So I love that story, not only because it shows, you know, her ability to found and fund an organization. There's a lot for Black students, Black speakers, and Black music, but also her understanding and her analysis of who she was fighting for and who she was fighting with.
Thank you. That was two great stories. So Peniel, I'm going to turn to you. And I mean, I think most of us here think we know King and Malcolm, and I love that you said that there's really a New York story to tell about them. So I would hope that maybe one of the stories you're willing to tell about them is sort of how we see them in New York. But tell us that we don't know about them. Sort of show us how in some ways unfamiliar we are with both of them.
Yeah, I think one great story is a New York story where in December of 1964, Dr. King has just won the Nobel Prize, and he's giving a big speech in Harlem at the 369th Armory, and there's over 8,000 people there. And in the audience, sitting next to Andy Young, is Malcolm X. And it's the second time Malcolm listens to him give a whole speech. and Nelson Rockefeller's there. All these different people are there. And Malcolm sits for the whole speech, and he's hanging out with Andy Young. And a few days later, he's saying how much, how impressed he was with the speech, right, in December of '64. And this is right around the time he's hosting Fannie Lou Hamer. He's hosting SNCC Activist in New York. And it's really remarkable because Andy Young remarks on it in his memoirs too. But it's something that, we usually don't think about. We think about King and Malcolm, just the March 26, 1964 meeting at the US Senate Gallery. And another great Malcolm New York story is in early '65, he goes to Albany for the State of the State, the State of the Union, the State of the New York State that Nelson Rockefeller is going to give. And he's going there because Percy Sutton, his lawyer, has also become a representative, a New York State representative, one of the first. So people like Percy Sutton, David Dinkins, these were all people who Malcolm knew. Sutton was his lawyer, but they become very important folks, Manhattan Borough President, mayor, sort of the first Black elected officials. And he listens to Governor Rockefeller do this speech. And afterwards, the reporters ask him, what did he think of the speech? And he says that the speech was very long, but the part on civil rights was too short. And it's one of those classic Malcolm quips. Right. So, I think, when it comes to Malcolm and King, I think one of the stories it also is the way in which Malcolm is radicalized by events in Birmingham, Alabama, and that Malcolm is not just in New York when Birmingham happens, he's in Washington, D.C. as head of Muslim Mosque number 4. And that's a very interesting story because even as Malcolm is very critical of the movement, civil rights movement that is, that whole year, he is sort of talking to folks who are part of SNCC in Washington, D.C. That whole year, he's talking to King's lawyer, Clarence Jones. He's really connected, and he's in D.C. when the March on Washington happened. So there is sort of 6 degrees of separation between those two, and '63 sort of radicalizes him, and it certainly helps to radicalize Dr. King as well.
Thank you. So Pam, tell us something. Again, I think with Julian Bond, we know him, we know his voice from Eyes on the Prize. So tell us a story or a couple stories that kind of show us.
Well, I think one way of showing who Julian was is actually to read a passage in the book. Because he really sprinkled his lectures with a lot of his own experiences. And of course, his students thought that he had been in attendance at every event that mattered. And so they always wanted stories. But this is one where and I'm going to read it because he writes about it so beautifully. He's talking about the wave of violence after World War II in the South. And he says, my earliest memory of racial violence is the nightstick beating and blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard in Aiken, South Carolina in 1946. Woodard was returning home after 3 years in the Army and arrested after an argument with the bus driver because he wanted to use the restroom. He was brutally beaten by police officers, including being jabbed in the eyes with nightsticks. The Aiken police chief was indicted for the beating, but was acquitted as a courtroom full of whites cheered. I will remember the newspaper photographs of Sergeant Woodard, his bandaged eyes beaten into darkness as long as I live. I was 6 years old. And then there's a footnote which says that Julian was interviewed for a book about Sergeant Woodard in 2014 and cried as he recalled the story and said, I still weep for this blinded soldier. So I think it tells a lot about Julian that this was and why he became a race man, as he liked to call himself, in the mold of W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. He too, as Peniel, had a family that was race conscious and encouraged him, although he dropped out of Morehouse the semester before his last semester in his senior year. That was not something that his parents necessarily were pleased about, but they were always supportive. And his father was an educator, his mother was a librarian, and so the race consciousness began early and obviously never ended.
Thank you. Just for people just coming on, we are going to be putting the Schomburg shop, so you can buy these books in the chat periodically. So just so you can know that you can buy them at the Schomburg shop tonight. And again, we'll keep putting that in the chat. So I guess where I wanted to go next is that I think, and obviously I have written a great deal about the myths that cloud our ability to see the civil rights movement, to see these activists clearly, to see their legacies clearly. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about a myth, a way that we miss aspects of their life, of their work, of their legacies. It could be one myth, it could be a couple of interrelated myths, but sort of what clouds us from seeing kind of the fullness of their legacies. Peniel, let's start with you.
I think there's two myths, strong myths about Malcolm and Martin that really clouds us. One, for Malcolm, it's a twin myth of that he is pro-violence, and also a myth that he is constrained by the Nation of Islam and he's only good his last year. So it becomes, so on one level, this is this violent brother who's basically nuts. And the other one is that he gets well for the last sort of 6 months of his life and then is assassinated. So basically we got this small window where Malcolm is saying, white folks can be part of the solution, and that's the Malcolm we have. So that's a big myth that really hurts us. And then the myth with King is the myth of nonviolence, right? We set up a King where we equate nonviolence as somehow counter or anti-revolutionary. And from that perspective, you get sort of Malcolm as the bad cop and King as the good cop. And so I think that pushing away from that and seeing how even the metaphor, the title of the book, The Sword and the Shield, instead of seeing King as the shield and Malcolm as a sword, we see them as both, and we see them starting out as, adversaries turned rivals, turned each other's alter egos. And so you can really see Dr. King is a revolutionary who's also nonviolent, right? And he scares the wits out of the United States, being anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, pro-reparations, anti-poverty, right? And the Poor People's Campaign. But then Malcolm, as this stirring revolutionary who believes in self-defense, and everyone should know self-defense is as American as apple pie when we think about the Second Amendment, right? And who believes in Black dignity. And so when I talk about, and we can talk about that later, but dignity versus citizenship and how you need both, but those myths really hurt us. And finally, I think both of the myths underestimate how much they were both intellectuals, right? They're both, we don't want to give any Black people credit as being intellectuals. We don't want to give it to Black women. We don't want to give it to Black men. We don't want to give them credit. Our people are not giving credit as intellectuals. Whether they have PhDs or not is irrelevant. They're just Black. And so intellectual and Black don't go together. Our students don't think of it that way. So that's a tough road to hoe. Yes.
Thank you. Pam, what? Or you could talk about the ways that Julian saw some of the key myths that clouded our ability to see the movement clearly.
Yes, well, I think that is clear throughout the lectures and in almost every speech he ever gave, where he talked about the movement, and certainly SNCC and his participation in the movement. That, you know, he used to say that certain people saw the movement as Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and then good white people made everything better. And he spent a lot of time undermining that myth. And that was an important part of his teaching. And I think that it's an important part of the book, that he did not adhere to the master narrative. And I think maybe that coincides to some extent with, I think he was perceived during his lifetime as less radical than he was. I think maybe that was partly because of his celebrity status. I mean, he hosted Saturday Night Live, and so how radical can you be? But really, it's the consistent thread. And his father, Horace Mann Bond, who was a noted educator and the first Black president of Lincoln University, you know, and it tells you something that was a university created for Black men, and which didn't have a Black president for 90 years. And so and then it didn't have Dr. Bond for long either, because he was pretty radical in his views. So I think it's ironic because Julian's career and certainly his familiarity to most people centered around his not being seated by the Georgia legislature because of the anti-war statement that SNCC had issued, which he had not written, but which he supported. And so for a long time, he was seen as having committed treason by the people in Georgia. But other people, I think the larger view was to be surprised at his radicalism if they really listened to what he was saying. I'm not sure they always did.
Ashley, can you sort of, what myths cloud our ability to see Patton, to see the work of kind of Black women radicals?
Yeah, I think two kind of come to mind. One, and certainly Brian's work also speaks to this, is that these Southern HBCUs were not places of kind of radical organizing and activity. You know, Patton especially, but not exclusively, really transformed Tuskegee University into a space that was an epicenter of activism that worked alongside, but not necessarily within or subsumed within SNCC. And she stuck around and did that for a lot of time, even after she graduated. So sometimes we think a lot about HBCUs as respectability politics and as places that shun organizing. And certainly Patton had her fights with the administration over her efforts, but I do think that she was largely responsible for turning that space into one of the more radical spaces for movement organizing in the 60s. And then my second kind of major myth, which is one that I often point out in my book on women in Black Power, is the idea that I saw men theorized and women organized, right? The idea that men are putting out these massive amounts of writings, these analyses of race and class and gender, and women are just kind of the foot soldiers that enact that. Patton, as you really see from reading her autobiography, was a consummate intellectual, a prolific writer, a prolific traveler, and published in everything from academic journals to you know, press releases to articles in Muhammad Speaks, right? And she really did over her life develop a concrete analysis of race, class, and gender that many picked up on and use today. So I think those are kind of two myths that she really helps us rethink about the civil rights movement.
Thank you. So as both Brian and I began, one of the points of this series, right, is to kind of use this history to help us see the present more clearly. And certainly in thinking about the legacies of these activists, maybe each of you could tell us a story or two from their lives, from their work, that help us see where we are today in this country, where we need to go, you know, in terms of organizing, in terms of seeing kind of the state of the nation more clearly. You could take it in either direction. Pam, let's start with you.
Okay, well, I think Julian, as a founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, certainly saw himself in the Black Lives Matter movement, which he greatly admired. And I think that the two have a lot in common. One thing that the student movement of the 60s, I think, illustrates, and sometimes people say about the Greensboro sit-ins, if you have 3 friends, you can start a movement. And that's really what happened with the sit-in movement. And Ashley talked about colleges and universities being breeding grounds, and that's certainly where the SNCC people came from. That's how Julian got involved. A fellow student said, have you seen what's happening in Greensboro? And Julian said, of course, and surely it'll happen here. And the friend said, why don't we make it happen? And Julian always told the story that before he could say, what do you mean we? He was organizing half the room and a friend was organizing the other. And that was the beginning of the Atlanta student movement. So I think one of the things that comes out, I mean, it just resonates so much what he's talking about then, now, because we are in, as I said, at least another moment, if not a continuation of the movement. I mean, I think the freedom struggle, Julian always said when he was alive, began in Jamestown and continues to this day. And if he were still with us, he would say obviously that it continues now. Yeah. So I think while the problems are immense and the solutions often evasive, the one thing that I would want people to take away from this, if above all else, is there is always hope, and there can't be change without it. And so that's what Julian would want people to think about as they read the lectures.
Thank you. Peniel, how about we turn to you? Tell us a story or two from their lives that helps us see where we are today more clearly.
I'll tell one story from Malcolm and the other from King. I think that Malcolm and his trips to Africa in 1964 are really key here, both taking the Hajj pilgrimage, but also going to the Organization of African Unity conference in July of 1964 while Harlem is actually burning, because Malcolm sees before King the depth and breadth of white supremacy globally. So even what we're seeing when we think about Black Lives Matter, and people talk now about intersectional identity, they dealt with intersectional issues as well. And so the amplification now is connecting intersectional identity to intersectional issues. But Malcolm really pushed back against the idea that America just needed simple reform and not radical restructuring. And so when Malcolm is saying that the civil rights movement has to be a human rights movement, that's hugely important and really galvanizing for people globally. So the anecdote is really Malcolm at the Oxford Union in 1964, because that sort of encapsulates Malcolm. He's speaking to Caribbean, African, Asian, and South Asian and white students. And he's telling them that they can all be part of the solution irrespective of their color, as long as they want to change the miserable condition on the face of this earth, he says. And that's broadcast live to the BBC, but he's talking about capitalism. He says that, folks who are capitalists are he uses terms like bloodsuckers. He's talking about socialism there and social democracies, and he's impressed by Scandinavian countries, but he links it back to Harlem and to Africa, right? So what's interesting, at that Oxford Union speech, he's defending the phrase extremism in defense of liberty is no vice for the opposite reasons that Barry Goldwater said it. Barry Goldwater is the white supremacist senator from Arizona who said it as a defense of white supremacy and Herrenvolk democracy, right? Malcolm is saying extremism in defense of liberty is no vice in the cause of human rights. So that's one. The second is really Dr. King, the anecdote of King in Marks, Mississippi, in Quitman County in 1968, early 68 in February. And Dr. King is in tears when he's hearing these Black women and men discuss the poverty there and the children with no shoes. And he gives them a couple of stories. It's great. And we have the footage of this where Dr. King, he tells them about the fact that Black folks were due 40 acres and a mule after, you know, slavery and during Reconstruction, but they didn't get it. And then he compares that story to the Homestead Act and how European immigrants and American citizens were given millions of acres of free land. But King gets into the granular details of the supply chain of power and privilege connected to white supremacy. He says these folks were not just given free land, they were given agents who taught them how to farm the free land, right? And Black folks weren't giving any of that. And then King fast forwards to the Great Society and says, these are the same people telling you to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. And so then, you know, what's interesting in there, you know, everybody's jaws dropped, right? And King is like on fire. And he's really has learned the lessons of both the time period, but I argue, you know, Malcolm. Sometimes we don't want to say the Black radical tradition includes sisters and brothers who've been liberal, who've been more moderate, who've been centrist, who become radicalized, right? And that's what happens to King. So I think that's really important to the way we live now, because we are amidst America's third Reconstruction. I'm writing something about this now. And this period that we're talking about that King and Gwen Patton and Julian Bond lived in, it's America's second Reconstruction. And it's really not just the heroic period from 54 to 68. It's really that long Black Power movement, not civil rights movement. I'm going to say the long Black Power movement that's going to include, you know, the Black women that Eric McDuffie talks about, that Ashley talks about, that Dale Gore talks about. There's a whole group of Black women and men who, you know, Southern Negro Youth Congress, Sally Davis, right? Who are right there in the cut in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there is a river. So the second Reconstruction really starts in earnest, Great Depression, Second World War, not during the Brown decision, because by Brown, we're getting a more reactionary Cold War politics, right? We should have had all these changes in the 1940s, right? When the first March on Washington was threatened, right? So when we see it that way, we can have these two, and really everyone's talking about. Julian Bond is a titan, Gwen Patton is a titan. These are towering figures of this second Reconstruction, which give us a context to look at our own time.
Thank you. Ashley, a story or two that kind of helps us think about where we are.
Yeah, so one of the things I think Patton's autobiography is great for is kind of, it's a manual for creating your own analysis and organizing in two ways. So, I mean, one of the things that goes through Patton's work is a class analysis. She is undeniably and unabashedly a middle class woman. She was a woman of privilege. And sometimes that made it seem as though she shouldn't belong in certain spaces, but she never took that, but she understood there's differences in class amongst people in the Black community, but we can be united in our analysis of what's happening to Black people and trying to be, you know, working with an idea that everybody deserves economic inequality or ending economic inequality. So I think that that standpoint, I think, was really important for her. The other thing that really stands out from the book is the way in which she finds a problem and sits down and just works for it, right? She doesn't always have a plan intact. There isn't always this huge long end goal. It's not always connected to this organization with all this money and this framework. Sometimes it can be as simple as helping somebody in the welfare office or the jail cell next to you. And sometimes it's much bigger in terms of helping, you know, an entire student body. But she sees the work in front of her. She says, I'm equipped to do something about it. And she kind of sits down and works and figures it out as she goes. So sometimes the idea of solving or getting involved in organizing can feel overwhelming, right? Like you don't know where to start or an entry point. And I think Patton helps us understand that we start where we are and we connect and forge coalitions and we see how it works. And then finally, I think that one of the things that she was a lifelong advocate of was organizing students, right? When she was a student, she was the king of that or the queen of that. And then she spent a lot of her life creating structures for organizing students when she got older. She found a lot of power in college campuses and student bodies and student-run organizations. And I think we should find a similar hope in those spaces today.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to remind the audience that we're getting close to the time when we're going to be able to start reading out some questions for the audience. So if you are sitting on a question or formulating a question, now would be a good time to drop it in the chat, either here in the Zoom window or if you're watching on YouTube, in the YouTube chat, and we'll try to pull all of those in and read them out very soon. I actually want to just ask about, and in some ways you've been addressing it, but I can't help coming back to it. And maybe you have this as well, but a kind of experience of resistance sometimes to the civil rights movement, or what is often called, let me say, the civil rights movement. I hear you, Peniel Joseph, trying to reframe it as a Black Power movement. But what people receive, let's say, as a civil rights movement or era, and sometimes I think that's because of the way the US has decided to kind of hold it up, almost, raise all of these figures up on a pedestal so high above, out of reach of any mere mortal. And sometimes I think it's maybe a function of the continued resurgence of organized and institutional white supremacy that makes people question, makes young people often ask very bluntly whether or not that movement did anything, like did it accomplish anything? I don't know if you experienced this kind of dismissiveness of this era and trying to think about how we understand an era where there were big sweeping changes and yet not all of the changes. How do you bring your students or other young people you encounter into a discussion about this era, given some of these misconceptions or their preconceptions about how to understand its place in time in relation to where we are? Let me start with you, Pam.
Well, I don't have students, but if I did, and I know a lot, Julian always said, I'm a lawyer. He always said he became a lawyer by being married to me. And I at least became a student of the movement by being married to him, if not an academic. And his students often came to him. I don't think it was not so dismissive so much as lacking understanding. I would never have gotten on the back of the bus. I would never have gone to the back of the bus. I mean, and his own children said that to him. So I think that's why you have to go way back before Rosa Parks gets on the bus to understand why you would not have just gotten on the bus. And then I think, and it's sort of related to that sometimes students something would happen and they would say to him, this is just horrible and things have never been this bad. And not understanding at all, how bad things were, and that whatever happens, we're never going back to that. But I think it's ironic because maybe to the extent that some people are dismissive, other people hold it up as the be all and the end all. It solved all the problems, and why are you still talking about them? Although I think that's what I think has changed a bit with the focus on the police killings. That I think people really didn't. I mean, they were wallowing in ignorance, and many of them chose that, and they have had to wake up a bit.
Thank you. What about you, Ashley? How do you deal with the way young people are coming towards this history?
It's interesting to see I think there's been a resurgence in interest about it, particularly in Black women's history, in thinking about why we're like this and the role Black women have played. I certainly think that has to do with political climate. I think that has to do with, the rise of folks like Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams. But Really, I think some of the best ways to do it are to take familiar figures. I mean, Jean is the queen of this, and then blow up their mind about what you think they know about them, right? So, you know, something as simple as taking a Rosa Parks and then giving them Jean's wonderful chapter from Want to Start a Revolution, where they realize that they've been given the iceberg in what is a massive sliver, and made somebody that is incredibly dynamic, and has a diverse range of politics into this very kind of small thread. You know, another example of doing that is showing them the March on Washington and seeing that there was an argument to end police brutality there, the same way there's an argument to end police brutality here. And when they start to see that, you know, some of the same issues are coming up over and over again, they don't feel so disconnected from the history. And when they feel like somebody hasn't told them all of the story and they're hungry for more, I think that's an entry point to help them really get a fuller understanding of the movement. But it really is troubling these iconographic figures and, you know, showing them the continuities from today.
Thank you. Peniel, what's your experience here?
You know, Brian, I think that's a great question. And listening to both what Pam and Ashley said, I think I try to push back against notions of American exceptionalism, and really try to teach them what that means in terms of America as this sort of shining city on a hill, this beacon of light, and a place where all things are possible, and how there's a version and a narrative that the civil rights movement plays in that larger narrative of American exceptionalism, right? And so you can love King, you can love Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, if they play their role, if they play their part. Now, Malcolm would have talked about house Negroes versus field Negroes in this situation. But I talk about, you know, American exceptionalism is based on two big lies. One of the lies James Baldwin talked about, Eddie Glaude talks about in Begin Again, this lie of dehumanization. A lot of scholars have talked about this, of course, but Black dehumanization, so that, you know, you could say Black people are this species of property, and you can have racial slavery and its aftermath, right? But the other lie is that the first lie didn't happen, you know? And so, you know, it's interesting writing about this now, because I'm writing something that deals with this moment, but also the first two reconstructions. And it's very, very interesting, the echoes and the parallels here, right? And I think that, you know, one thing Pam was talking about, you know, we're never going to go back. I would actually push back against that. I think that every generation has the right, and this is I get from Malcolm, to define their own trauma. So I don't think what we should be doing is comparing the Breonna Taylor and the George Floyds to you know, Emmett Till and you know, Recy Taylor, and just different folks who were raped and assaulted and murdered and mutilated in the 1930s or in the 1830s. I think we do ourselves a disservice by saying that there was this single generation in slavery that had it the worst, and subsequently we've all had it better. That's just empirically not true. You know, it really depends on who you are. We have more Black people in jail now than we did in the past. We have more Black people on death row now than we did in the past. Now, we also have more wealthier Black people. So I guess for them, things are better. So if you're on this webinar and you're part of that group, you know, God bless you, right? But not everybody is part of that group, right? So I think the idea that, you know, democracy and racial progress works in a linear fashion is untrue. And that's why my final word is that in Ferguson, when civil rights leaders tried to come to Ferguson, and Jean, you know this, they were booed in 2014 and 15. And they were booed, hear me out, everybody. They were booed because they were lying to the kids in Ferguson. They told the kids in Ferguson that voting rights and the Civil Rights Act had changed everything. And Ferguson, like, Black people were 66% below the poverty line, where Michael Brown was murdered. Ferguson, right? And they were lying. And guess what? They were booed, because the kids who were booing them in Ferguson and who took down the Quick Mart, they had missing teeth at 12 and 13 and 14, 15. Everybody on this call, at least my panelists, we have access to dental care. We know we do. So I'm going to just say it. We all have access to dental and health care, but not everybody does in the United States. So if you're telling kids with missing teeth who go without food on the day-to-day, that the civil rights movement solved their problems of citizenship and dignity, they know you're lying. And so booing becomes the right thing to do, right? So part of it is we've done a bait and switch. We lie and say the civil rights movement worked, and then it's sort of your fault if it's not working for you in 2020 and 2021. And for all of us, my final note, Brian, including everybody at the Schomburg, now that the insurrection has happened, George Floyd 2020, we all have a lot of work to do too, because we know that Blackness has become a new commodity. It's become commodified with bestsellers lists and people wanting our expertise and willing to pay for that expertise. People are fundraising, and yes, they're fundraising in the name of equality, but we're all part of this neoliberal paradigm too, you know? I've been at conferences where people say they're making their own clothes, so they're not in part of the supply chain. But come on, you know, we're part of it, whether you're growing your own vegetables or not, whether you're not eating meat and you're vegan or not, you're part of it. So we have a lot of ethical work to do too, because suddenly the things that we have dedicated our lives to, it's hot and it's a commodity now, and everyone knows what I'm saying. There's a commodification that we're all a part of here. Which is dangerous.
Yeah. And I think part of what we're chewing through is how to take from this history things that aren't about beating up the next generation in the name of the past or lying to them, as you say, or that sort of thing, bringing these figures down to earth so that you can see how regular people can make change like they did when they found themselves wherever they were, as Gwen Patton would have put it. We have two questions now. I'm going to start reading some questions. We have two that are kind of about this, about features of the movement that people seem to feel are missing today. And this is one of the things I'm sure you get a lot. One attendee writes, all of the individuals you were talking about sustained involvement in a movement they cared about all their lives. What kept them going? Did they get discouraged? How did they handle that? I'm wondering how you keep central in your life this commitment and passion over so many years in one's life and generations before you as well. And then there's another question that's, you know, in my mind in the same vein, which is Martin and Malcolm are iconic figures, but today's movements feel like they're missing that persona. Is that good or bad? Is there someone young, 20s or 30s, you see us writing about 60 years from now? Ashley, you want to respond to either or both of those?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, Patton struggled a lot. She struggled with her health a lot in the process. She struggled with fearing for her life. She struggled with moving from job to job. When she tried to get stable employment, she was denied tenure, right? So I don't want to give the impression that there, and then like I told you with the story earlier, her car was, you know, bombed. There was a very real danger in doing this work. But she always peppers her autobiography with these moments of joy and community. She talks about the ways in which they would get together in an apartment and just drink and hang out, right? She talks about dancing a lot. She talks about the ways in which food was a space in which they would all gather around. So, you know, it's a duality that they struggle with. And I think that a large part of the reason she was able to sustain it for so long was because she was resourceful with making her own kind of positions, right? She would go to a place and say, you need somebody that organizes this. Why don't you put me on the payroll to do so, right? And then kind of take that money and reinvest in the community in different ways. But I do think that one of the things that activists have learned and we are continuing to work on is the idea that this is a long and difficult thing to sustain. Excuse me. And the more people go in, the more people can tap out. And to the final question about do we need an icon? I would say universally not, right? That has gone badly for a large amount of people, not only because you're likely to get killed or be the target of severe government repression, but also because I think it doesn't do a service to the future generations. It makes people feel as though you have to be so unique and so brave and so one of a kind to be able to engage in these kinds of things. that it doesn't give us a diffuse understanding of what it really takes for a movement to go forward. And it isn't a sustainable practice when you organize around one icon. When that person is gone, it's really hard to move forward. So I think that one of the things that we've learned from past struggles is the need to not have, a singular iconic figure. It doesn't mean we can't have charismatic figures. But as, the famed Ella Baker said, strong people don't need strong leaders, right?
Thank you. Pam, how do you respond to these questions, either or both?
Well, I think one of the things that I was trying to say before is I certainly agree that the movement is not linear, and sometimes you take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and sometimes you take 2 steps forward and 4 steps back, and that has certainly been the history. But I think that there's a danger in saying that the civil rights movement didn't accomplish anything, because that's a disincentive to continuing a certain kind of activism. And for Julian, I mean, he would have he admitted that he was a hopeless optimist, and I think that served him well. And you have to have, as I said before, some sense of hope and optimism. And he didn't want a tombstone; he wanted a bench. And he always said he wanted it on one side to say "race man," which I mentioned before. He proudly considered himself, and he wanted the other side to say "easily amused," and that was because he had a sense of humor. And I think, for most of the SNCC people I know would agree that you need to have humor, and as Ashley said, you have to find release in just having a good time. And SNCC, certainly they were comrades, and that lasted through the rest of their lives. And I think you need that comradeship. It's not something you're going to be able to do alone, even though I also agree that we're probably better off without a single leader. Although I will say that I think if there is a movement today, it could use a little music. The civil rights movement had great music, and there doesn't seem to be the same focus, and because that's also a means of bringing people together.
I'd say there's a lot of music. I think that there really are bold-faced names. I mean, No Name, the rapper, Tamika Mallory, Megan Thee Stallion. There's a lot of folks. The people we're going to be talking about in decades, I think Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, Brittany Packnett, Patrice Cullors. There's a lot of grassroots folks who are out there who are actually very, very well known, who are, artists and activists and organizers and intellectuals, who are Black women, who are queer, radical Black feminists. So I actually think this generation has sort of a panoramic, major boldface names. So I do think you need leaders. And, I love Ella Baker, but I think that, you can have strong people and you can have leadership, you know what I mean? So I think as part of it, I think with all the stuff that we do as historians, none of these people, sometimes we treat them as biblical figures. None of them are God, none of them are Jesus. And I'm saying this as a Christian. and so we can critique, they had envy and jealousy. They're just like us. You know what I mean? They had hard times. They're just like us. In terms of the question, Martin and Malcolm, at times they were very despairing. At times it was very depressing. They're both assassinated at 39. They leave 10 children behind collectively. Malcolm, a set of twins he never gets the chance to see, right? They both leave behind widows who are, political partners, but who don't have resources at the time, and they really leave them bereft, right? But I think what held them together was both their faith, their religious faith, in terms of Dr. King being a Christian and Malcolm being this deeply religious Muslim. But they also believed, they really, really believed in this idea of Black citizenship and dignity. So I do remain hopeful. And I think all of us should be doing something that sustains us, including Julian Bond's, easily amused. You have to laugh. You have to love your family. You're doing this because of that. I mean, the best part of this is meeting people who really walk the talk, right? Meeting people who are interested in social justice, but are really lovely human beings and not, not something else, even as we've met those folks too. So yeah, we should be hopeful, but we have to also be, realistic about what we're facing. But this generation of leadership, I think it's fabulous what we're seeing.
Thank you. We have a question about nonviolence and self-defense. I'm going to read out the question, but I kind of also, with apologies to the asker, want to broaden it in one way just to all of the panels to respond to. But let me read it first. It's from Alyssa. I'm curious about the suggested difference between nonviolence and self-defense. At least 2 books address the ongoing importance of self-defense within the nonviolent civil rights movement, and then refers to This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed by Charles Cobb and We Will Shoot Back by Akinyele Umoja. And then it asks, Alyssa asks, can Professor Joseph, but let's amend it to everybody, comment on the important role of self-defense within the nonviolent civil rights movement? Does this history lead to a conclusion that nonviolence and self-defense are not necessarily diametrically opposed? And then Alyssa thanks you for the sword and the shield and for this amazing forum. Thank you, Alyssa, for the question. But I want to broaden it in this way, in that this question of violence and of nonviolence and of self-defense, I think, is something that reemerges and that sometimes teachers often struggle with, and how to bring into the classroom, have a conversation about those issues. So I'd just like you all to kind of comment on how you reflect on these questions of violence and nonviolence and self-defense, both in the ways that Alyssa raised, but also more broadly. But let's start with you, Peniel.
You know what? I want to listen to the others and what they say. Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with Ashley.
Oh man, I was hoping you weren't going to say me. That's like, I was taking me some time to think about, what I think Dr. Patton would say about this. I mean, yeah, I think that there's certainly, there's no one didn't understand the very real realities of the danger of this work, right? And anybody that was getting into this work understood that they were doing it and driven by the idea that they had something they wanted to protect, right? And I think that is where the intersection of self-defense came in for Patton. She certainly was not ever an out-and-out advocate of violence in terms of, just we're going to go out and attack, but she certainly understood that there was, a very real threat to her life and the life of those around them, and that, anything worth fighting for was worth protecting. And if people wanted to do that through armed, self-defense, that was totally fine. I often share a couple of stories, one from Charlie Cobb's book about, the ways in which they tried to protect Martin Luther King. I share stories from Jean's work, right, about the kinds of protection they had to engage in, Rosa Parks had to engage in order to do everything from the Scottsboro Boys, through, the kind of organized protesting that she did later in her life, to explain to them that, there was no one that was exempt from feeling fear, and there was no one that was exempt from needing self-defense if they were going to survive and thrive in this movement. And I think that kind of, when you put those figures that are seen as quote unquote nonviolent in that context, that really helps students kind of trouble the idea of what is an avocation for violence and what is just saying, there's a threat to my life and I have a right to protect myself.
I'm just going to jump in for a second, because I actually interviewed Gwen Patton when I was writing the Rosa Parks book. And she was at first very sort of wary, and I think was very, worried, understandably so, about what sort of history of Mrs. Parks I was going to give, and was I going to really talk about some of the self-defense aspects of Mrs. Parks's life. And then once I sort of established that we were going to talk about those things, and they were going to be part, both in terms of Scottsboro, but also to the end of her life, right? She is a believer in self-defense. She in many ways, feels a kind of kinship to Malcolm, even as much as she loves and admires King, because of the ways that Malcolm understood self-defense. And so it was very interesting that sort of once I established that, like our whole interview changed, because it was just like, okay, now we're really talking about, you know, we can talk about this in a complicated manner.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add to that, I mean, you know, one of the stories that she often tells is, you know, working with Lowndes County Freedom Organization and really, you know, having to patrol the polls with guns, right, in order to give people the right to even vote, or having to go into a particular fight or meeting with people, you know, basically as her security or the group of student security, and calling on the deacons of defense sometimes to do so. So, you know, they understood being a part of life, why people were going to be as violent as they were.
Mm-hmm. Pam.
Yeah, I think people at the time, certainly the people in SNCC, understood that nonviolent did not mean no self-defense. They were not diametrically opposed. People practiced self-defense all the time in the movement. I mean, for one thing, it was a Southern movement and everybody had guns, the good guys and the bad guys. And, you know, there were times, there was a story Julian always told about being stopped on a road late one night and with two other Black activists, and the white people let them go. But in the morning, they went to a Black cafe and the people there said, we had your back. We were in the bushes last night. And, you know, they meant that they were armed. And I think, Jean, what was that? What was the case in North Carolina where the NAACP kicked the
Robert F. Williams. You're talking about
and Rosa Parks was a big defender, and Julian, when he became chair of the NAACP, always was quite vocal in saying that was one of the bad moments in NAACP history of what happened with Mr. Williams, because there was nothing wrong with self-defense. So.
Yeah, so you know, Brian, in terms of building on what they're saying, I think the third aspect, because I agree with everything everybody said, is there were two ways to try to use self-defense, and I think the work of of Jean and people like Simon Went and Akinyele Umoja, Deacons for Defense, We Will Shoot Back, The Spirit in the Shotgun, but so much more, shows that there were folks who were using self-defense to protect civil rights activists, right? To protect civil rights activists, including Dr. King, even after Bayard Rustin tells him he shouldn't have these folks protecting him. When King is in Mississippi, people are still protecting him with guns. So there's another version too, though, and this is the one that really America gets very frightened of. And you see this with not just the Black Panthers, but with other groups who they're talking about utilizing self-defensive violence against state violence. So this isn't just in defense of civil rights organizing. This isn't in defense of reform. They're saying we are going to use violence in response to both structural violence like poverty and things like that, but also in terms of law enforcement as this sort of occupying army in whether it's in urban centers or rural ghettos, right? And it's very interesting because even now, when you think about BLM and people said 93% of the protests were nonviolent, right? And really most of the violence we saw was coming from the state. It was coming from law enforcement, right? Then at times there was what the state calls violence, but as we saw during Katrina, it was poor people looking to get food and looking to get resources, right? And then there's a smaller group who might have really been either at times white supremacists or people who were opportunists who were trying to take advantage of sort of the parade-like atmosphere of protest. So those are all these different things in that milieu. So when we think about Malcolm X, though, Malcolm X really only ever talked about self-defensive violence, right? And that's really not violence. I think we have to say that self-defense is a human right. It's not violence. If somebody's trying to kill you and you're trying to protect yourself, that is all Malcolm said. So when Malcolm talked about Black people needed to defend themselves against four-legged dogs or two-legged dogs in Birmingham, he was saying that what was happening in Birmingham was morally reprehensible and politically indefensible. So one of the things we have to remember with violence versus nonviolence is that what Malcolm understood really better than, and Angela Davis has taught us this too, with her major works on abolishing prison, but also on slavery and just so much others. Malcolm and Angela, two of the best theorists and organizers and activists of doing what? Debunking the legitimacy of state-sanctioned violence. So Malcolm straight up, and Angela too, they've said, look, these cops and the law enforcement that's doing this isn't real. You can't say that this is okay because a police officer and somebody with a badge did it. And once they did that, they move on forward with their analysis. But remember, many people were very scared when you said that, right? And still are. If you're saying, look, let's not give, Malcolm would have, and Angela, let's not do qualified immunity. Let's throw all that out, right? let's end prisons, right? So when you think about nonviolence versus self-defense and violence, what we're never talking about is the state-sanctioned violence that is white supremacist violence. And my last word on this, we've seen it with the white supremacist mob riot at the Capitol, where the white folks at the Capitol have been let loose in comparison where some Black people there have not been let out of jail. But also just when we think about people like Khalif Brower and people who languished for years in Rikers for things they didn't do and then later passed away, we can see the unequal justice system, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and the violence of that.
The violence of that, yes.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for a few more questions. I want to put two together again and kind of broaden them to the whole panel. Abby writes to Dr. Farmer, in addition to your book, are there any other comprehensive studies of Black women in the Black Power and student movements? And I add that with a question from Rhoda, who writes, given that race, class, gender was materialized by women in the National Welfare Rights Organization in the mid-60s in advance of its birth in academia, can you say something about the contribution those women made to the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, to today's work? So broader questions about both resources for finding stories of Black women activism and how do we understand their broader contributions? Can we start with you, Ashley?
Yeah. So a couple of other books I would definitely mention are Sisters in the Struggle, which is a collection of essays that talks about women from the civil rights to Black Power movements. Another, Want to Start a Revolution, which also engages in kind of what Jean and Kamosi and Deo call like long distance runners, those who organized through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. I also would suggest you pick up something like Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is a collection of oral histories from Black women in SNCC. So there are lots, and Patton is among them, and they often speak about, the shift from SNCC from, what we would say is a classical civil rights organization to a Black Power organization. Another great book about Black women in the Panther Party is Robin Spencer's book as well. So there are some really great books, and I think it's a time for really exploring Black women, not just as activists, but as intellectuals. The second part of the question was about the National Welfare Rights Organization. Interestingly enough, Patton also worked with this group. There are many civil rights activists who overlapped with the National Welfare Rights Organization. And I would, by no stretch of the matter, were they not a huge contributor to the movement and class analysis. I would say that, they certainly weren't the first, but they hew from a kind of a larger history of everybody from something in the 50s, like the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, who also had that kind of feminist, class-based, Black-centered analysis. There were many groups within SNCC. For example, the Black Women's Liberation Caucus was also thinking about this. And there were also Black feminist organizations, which we should see under the larger umbrella of civil rights and Black power, like the National Black Feminist Organization or the Third World Women's Alliance. So without a doubt, a huge group, but I want you to perhaps, or I'm suggesting we perhaps see them as part of a cohort of discussions that extends from the 50s to the 80s of Black women all working in that kind of intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality that we now have absorbed in academia.
Okay, somebody's asking for that list again. And before we rewind the tape, we might have to write that down later. Maybe we'll send it out to everybody here. Because if
Okay.
you weren't typing fast enough or
Can I
jotting,
put it in the chat?
yeah, yeah.
You know, a great anthology
I'll
is
do
going to be Beverly Guy Sheftall's Words of Fire. There's a ton of great work by Kimberly Springer. We have some stuff in the Black Power Movement anthology and Neighborhood Rebels as well. So this is, yeah, it's panoramic. So it's definitely, it predates the Black Women of the Welfare Rights Association, but you know, they're very, very important. And for work on that, Pramila Nadesan has great work on welfare rights, and Annalise Orlac, Storming Caesar's Palace. And so there's a whole rich, you know, history there as well.
Thank you. Pam, you want to offer thoughts on this about Black women in the movement?
Well, I would just add, there's also a book called Hands on the Freedom Plow, which is not just Black women, white women too, but in SNCC. But the strength of it is, you know, they're telling their own stories of their movement life.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. I'm guessing we're getting to the end here, so this might be our last question, depending on your length of responses. So this might be a good time to also throw in some last thoughts. But Nilesh asks, how can we keep radical ideas, activism, and histories from being commodified, as has happened to figures like Rosa Parks, MLK, and more recently, the Black Panthers? Should that even be our focus, or would it be more impactful to instead focus on creating and disseminating our own radicalism?
You know, I want to dig into that. I think that, you know, because I mentioned this, so Nilesh, I feel you. I think it's really hard, and I think we just have to focus on sort of doing our own thing, because I think, again, this year, the last year has seen an uptick in interest, and as somebody who's been doing this for almost 30 years, just full time, I've seen the difference between, say, when Hurricane Katrina happened. And for those of us who are really on the ground, or visited New Orleans, or who, you know, and say when Obama came into office, and then the difference between that and BLM 1.0 versus the Trump age, and then now, you know, after George Floyd, right? So it's night and day, these things, in terms of just the interest, right? And so the news is that it's already commodified. You know, I think one of the most interesting parts about what sometimes people call late capitalism or racial capitalism, its ability to commodify all of us, right? So Kaepernick is commodified. You know, you could say aspects of BLM have been commodified already. It's there, man. Amanda Gorman is extraordinary, and it's like the next day there's a contract, you know? So we have to understand, it's like, it's not our fault. We've become these brands, right? And the bigger the brand, the more resources and amplification you have, right? So it becomes focusing more on these narratives and the stories and the work you're doing in the bailiwick that you're doing it with. There's no way to stop this commodification, at least right now. Yeah.
Pam, how do you see that?
No, I mean, I agree with that. And so I don't think it's worth spending a lot of time trying to fight it, except that you can create your own stories and histories to counter the commodification when it needs it. You know, you remember Mississippi Burning was like the first movie, and you know, it was shockingly, well, because it wasn't shocking, but it was inaccurate, and made the FBI the heroes of the movement.
Right.
But there, you know, you can push back against that by criticizing it and then getting your own, you know, hopefully getting your own films out there. But because I don't think you can stop it from happening in the first instance.
Thank you. Ashley?
I would say hi, Nilesh. This is one of our students. But also, I would say that you do exactly what it is that you know, you're doing, right? You, instead of taking a superficial glance and buying the Malcolm t-shirt or the Rosa t-shirt, you dig in, you take the classes, you read their work, and you decide which part of their analysis and which part of their frameworks and blueprints for things work for you. And you do your best to kind of, dig in where you want and be inspired by them, right? So not just taking the words and the catchphrases and the quotes on Twitter, but really engaging with what they have to say and the models for liberation that they offer you and deciding what works best for you in your life.
Okay, I'm really impressed with how pithy all three of you are here. I'm gonna keep going. I mean, until we run out of time. Donna writes, "This has been great!" 2 exclamation marks. Within this work, thank you, Donna. Within this work, people of color, particularly Black folks, can be very divided due to class, geography, educational attainment, and color, etc. And it can feel like an obstacle to feeling like concrete progress is made and sustained. How can we overcome or work through these issues?
In 25 words or less?
Yeah, at your pithiest. With you, Pam.
You go ahead, Peniel or Ashley.
I turn into a pumpkin at 7 sharp. So
I would just say that it seems to me that Black people, the only people held to the standard of togetherness that everybody else is, right? And no other group got to be united by class, by politics, by geography, by anything else. And we're not, right? And that's okay. Find your folk that, as Zora said, your skin folk that are actually kinfolk, not kinfolk, and work with them, right? Towards the world that you want to see. But this idea that we all have to get along to move forward, or that we have to kind of create some unity that is expected of no other group, I think is a distraction, if I'm being honest.
Thank you for that succinct. Pam, anything to add?
No, we're all opposed to distractions, whether it's commodification or being a united front in every area.
Gotcha. Peniel, I want to give you the last word then.
Oh yeah, no, I want to thank everybody for this opportunity. It's great, the work that Jean and Kamosi has organized, and now you with the Black Freedom Series. So this is just awesome. And for everybody out there, there's so much to buy and to purchase. The big thing is to tell your children this story and sort of tell them where they fit in before the society and social media and all these sort of negative narratives get to them. And then finally, Jean has a new book, the Rosa Parks, the young adult book, 12 and over, has just come out. So everybody should check that out, because we need to get the real.
They should buy that and not the Rosa Parks Barbie doll.
No, I didn't know there was a Rosa Parks Barbie doll. I missed that. I didn't know there's a Rosa Parks.
Speaking of
buy Jean's book instead of that.
All right. Well, thank you all for this conversation. And by the way, we are going to be talking about Jean's book next month. And we're back the first Thursday of every month here in Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, brought to you by the Schomburg Center. Thank you so much, Ashley Farmer, Pam Horowitz, Peniel Joseph, and Jean Theo Harris. And thank you all for tuning in. See you next time.
Thank you.